In today's lesson, and in this section, we are going to cover one of the most contested topics in web development today, CSS in JS. Now, you might have heard or read about CSS in JS all over the web development community. But in order for us to explore why it's such a hot topic, we need to understand what it is. Now, in order to understand what it is, let's just quickly go over what we already know about CSS. So the current way in React applications that we add CSS to our application is we import them into our component files, and we try to namespace our CSS to the top level components, classes, or any of the children's classes, but we scope them as best as we can with the CSS that we write. We've done this extensively in our application that we just built, but our application is still rather small in scale. One of the big issues with CSS is that when it was created, we were only making websites that were single pages or a collection of maybe 4 or 5 pages at most. And the styling, if you remember from the 90s, was very basic. Browsers were not that powerful back then, and the web was not as evolved as it is today. In today's day and age, we've built these complex applications that people could not even imagine back in the day. And as a result, coding standards have changed and adapted to these large-scale web applications that we build now. Now, what I have here is actually a quick little Create React app application to demonstrate CSS and JS. But before I go further, we have to talk more about the flaws in CSS. So inside of this application, what I have is just this basic app component that renders a card component. And what the card component is it's just a display component. So it just wraps whatever components are nested inside of it, so ergo the children property, and it wraps it in a div with the class name of card. And then the card has these styles on it. Very simple, very basic component, but it's a very generic component. Now, what we do is we scope our CSS to the class component that represents our card component. If, however, we were building a very large application with many elements that possibly resemble cards, you can imagine that if I implemented this card component near the start of the application, but 2 years down the road, or even 1 year down the road, another developer has to also implement something similar. Maybe they have a component that has a card inside of it, but they do not know that my card component already uses the class name card. Then what happens is that he might write another component, use the class name card, and then he suddenly gets my classes. The reason for this is because CSS all share one single global namespace. The moment that we import this CSS into our card component and our card component is rendered, JavaScript puts this styling into the head of our application. So we can actually see this when we look inside of our elements. We'll see right in the head all of the styles that we've got. These are all the style sheets that we've written. That's the index.css. This is my .card.css that I imported in. And then this is my app CSS, right? That's what happens whenever we import styles into our components. React separates it in such a way so that we're able to visualize that the style sheet is related to our component for our mentality's sake, but the rules of CSS have not changed. This .card class name and this .card styling will apply to any component that has .card in it. Now, of course, there are solutions that have been implemented in CSS, such as the BEM naming convention, And all BEM is that it's a style of naming your CSS so that you follow a certain format known as the block, the element, and then the modifier. So here, if we look at the naming, we can see that if we had a class of block, what we would do is we would apply a class name selector, as we've done. However, as you start nesting deeper, you start adding more to the name so that it becomes more specific, right? So if this span class is inside of our block, then what we'll do is we'll say block underscore underscore element so that we're targeting this span. As a result, what ends up happening is you have these really, really nested and really long class names on all of your components. But this is a huge mental overhead, especially for new developers coming onto the application. Not to mention that there's so much class names now that you have to be aware of what everything will be. But that adds extra mental overhead for us as developers, which is always a bad thing. But this is the default problem with CSS. As mentioned, BEM is a solution that was created based on the way that CSS was built, right? It's still a solution, but based on the cards that were dealt to us when CSS was created. Now, because in the modern world now, browsers are way faster, way more performant, and way more powerful, we can leverage JavaScript to actually create the CSS for us. There's actually a way that you can do this with React. And the way you do it with React is you simply use a style property inside of our components, our HTML elements. And what you would do is you would make a JavaScript object. So for example, if I said text styles, and I made it an object, and in the object, we just write CSS rules with the property being the rule name and the value being what we actually want it to be. But we, instead of using the kebab case we're used to, we would have to use camel case. So I could say color goes to red and font size goes to 24 pixels. I can now pass this text styles into this div using that style property, which exists on every HTML element. And now if we look, we'll see that the component actually gets the style directly written into the element. Now, the issue with doing it this way is that, one, we actually don't have access to all of the CSS selectors, right? So there's more specific selectors that we might want to leverage that we actually can't, such as the disabled selector, or we also cannot access nth child or the before selector, but there's a list of selectors that we cannot access doing it this way. Whereas using CSS and JS, it takes the approach in a completely different way. Now, before we explore the libraries, or one of the libraries, I want to talk briefly about it. So there have been numerous libraries released to tackle this problem of CSS in JS, but the one that's the most popular and the most supported is Styled Components. To this point, it has 24,000 stars on GitHub, and I think the next closest is either Radium or Aphrodite, but they aren't even close. They're barely at 10,000 stars. So we're going to explore Styled Components because it's the most popular one. But before we do, I just want to talk about what are the cons of doing CSS and JS. And as I mentioned, all CSS and JS is it's using a JavaScript library to render our styles. Very similar in a way to what we did here, where we wrote them, the styles that we wanted, for example, inside of our JavaScript and then added it to our JavaScript code. The only difference is the way that this was handled is that it got placed on our div. But what's still happening is that we're letting our JavaScript add our styles to our HTML. A lot of web purists believe that CSS should be in CSS and that CSS should not be in JS, right? Because there is an overhead. There does require a learning of it, especially for developers that have been writing front-end applications for a long time. They might be very comfortable with having CSS and CSS and having JS and JS. But the pro is that the performance is extremely fast now. Having JavaScript render the CSS is minimal, practically non-existent on performance. Not only that, but it actually gives us a closer alignment to the component-driven architecture that we're so used to today in how we write our React code. We write our React code because we compartmentalize all of the code that we're writing into components that have their own functionality. As a result, would it not make sense that we have our CSS also scoped purely to that component? We don't want this possibility of our styles leaking all over the place due to the CSS global namespace that it occupies. Well, this is actually exactly what CSS and JS aims to solve. By using JavaScript to render our CSS and our styling, we are able to encapsulate all of our CSS to just the component that is relevant. And I will show you how we'll do that using the styled components library. So let's take a look at how it works.